4 rounds struck the hull at point-blank range. None of them left a mark. The fourth impact rang off the bow shielding like a stone off still water, a flat, dead note that didn't echo. On the Zephrani flagship's bridge, every display held the same image, a human vessel, unarmed, unmoving, unmarked. Fleet Marshal Threx Doven's fused left claw stayed raised from the firing command, his carapace ridges catching the emergency glow. He had spent 40 years being right. He had 30 seconds left to be wrong. The human ship did not return fire. It did not accelerate. It did not send a transmission. For a long breath, the only thing that moved was the debris field drifting past the viewport, the same debris that had been a Zephrani patrol cruiser 3 minutes earlier. Then the Wintersgate fired once. The shot took less than a second to cross the gap. It did not touch the hull, the crew compartment, or a single life sign aboard Doven's flagship. It found the forward shield array and nothing else. A message, not a wound. On the Zephrani bridge, no alarm sounded. No one shouted an order. Doven stood with his hand still raised, and for the first time in 214 years, he had nothing prepared to say next. The doctrine had been correct for 7,000 years. It had simply never been tested. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. But the part that still keeps me up at night, that comes later. 3 hours earlier, in the Halvern Concourse, the War Chamber's long table gleamed under ion light. Fleet Marshal Threx Doven sat at its head, his iron-gray carapace ridges catching the same cold glow, his inside-out rank sash a quiet superstition he'd never explained. To his right, Intelligence Director Fyron, a Zephrani, with a polished talon and a 40-year-old ruling she treated as law, unfolded a holographic projection of the Aldergate expanse. "The patrol lane is clear," Fyron said. "No contacts for 23 standard cycles. We've shown the flag 4 times this quarter." Doven did not look at the projection. He was carving a fresh mark into the edge of his desk, a small, precise line in the wood, one more tally for verified doctrine calls. His claw moved with the same mechanical certainty he applied to everything else. "The Aldergate expanse is cleared for a flag-showing patrol," he said, still not looking up. "There's nothing out there that can touch us." Director Fyron nodded. She did not ask if he wanted to review the latest sensor sweeps. She had learned 40 years ago that Doven did not revisit settled facts. Across the table, Attaché Eilson Brand, small-bodied Osivane, her inner membranes flushing faintly, placed a data slate at the edge of the table. It contained a reading from the previous patrol cycle, one that had fallen below the threshold of official attention. She did not push it forward. She simply set it down, within the Fleet Marshal's peripheral sight, and waited. Doven did not glance at it. "File it under routine," he said. Brand's membranes went pale. She picked up the slate and did not speak. 3 hours earlier than that, if such a thing made sense, Ensign Rhea Ashdown was alone in the cockpit of a Terran Deep Watch scout, running a standard debris field sweep through the Aldergate expanse. The cockpit was cramped, the air recycled, the viewport smudged at one corner where she'd touched it with a glove. She'd been in the service 6 years, and the routine had long since worn the edges off anything that might have been called wonder. She checked her instruments. She noted the drift of a torn bulkhead. She logged the pass. Then the returns changed. The long-range sensor array, calibrated for hull signatures up to 800 meters, the upper limit of every human-built vessel on record, returned a reading of 4,650. Ashdown blinked. She logged it a second time. The number didn't change. She reached into her breast pouch and pulled out a scratched steel slide rule, her grandmother's worn smooth at one edge from decades of thumb work. She didn't need it. The computer had already computed. But she'd been taught to check twice, believe once. She slid the rule's cursor along its engraved scale, cross-checked the parallax offset, and counted again. 4,650. She logged the reading a third time. The number didn't change. Neither did her face. She keyed the comm. "Commodore Farrow, this is Scout Ashdown. I have an anomalous contact bearing 27 Mark IV. Size estimate." She paused, her thumb still resting on the warm steel edge, 4.65 kilometers, and it's moving, a long silence on the channel. Then Commodore Aldrich Farrow's voice, flat and unhurried. "Repeat that bearing." Ashdown read it off. She heard the subtle shift in Farrow's tone, not surprise, but something like a door being unlocked. "Hold your position," Farrow said. "Maintain passive sensors only. I'm waking the crew." Ashdown cut the channel and stared at the display. The hull signature was too clean. No drive plumes, no comms chatter, no heat bleed from a reactor that size. It was just there, a dark shape against the debris field waiting. She ran her thumb along the slide rule's edge again and realized she was checking it a fourth time without meaning to. She stopped, checking twice, believing once. She whispered to herself. It was her grandmother's saying, filed away in her memory as a habit, not a method. But looking at that 4,650-meter blank spot on the screen, she began to wonder if she'd misunderstood the whole thing. 200 kilometers behind Ashdown Scout, in the hidden hollow anchorage, a shipyard carved into the shadow of a dead gas giant, Chief Engineer Nomi Castellan stood beside the main engineering console with weld flux stains still drying on her hands. She was short, broad-shouldered, and had not slept in 32 hours. She was also at that moment the only person in the anchorage who didn't look surprised. Commodore Farrow walked into the bay with a cup of cold coffee and a calm that seemed to irritate everyone except Castellan. "They've found it," Farrow said. Earlier than projected, Castellan grunted. She tapped a sequence into the console, and a holographic schematic of the Winter's Gate rotated above the deck. It was a hull unlike any built before, not beautiful, not elegant, but load-bearing in every possible sense. Its dimensions, 4,650 meters, were not a mistake. "We don't build to be believed," Castellan said, quoting Farrow back at him. "We build to be ready," Farrow nodded. "And we've been ready for 13 years. He did not add that the hollow anchorage had operated for 13 years without a single line in any diplomatic filing. He did not need to. Castellan had built half of it herself. She picked up a torque wrench and checked a coupling. "What's the patrol composition?" "One Zafrani flagship, light escort. Fleet Marshal Dovin is in command." Castellan stopped mid-turn. "The one who never loses. He has never been tested," Farrow said. Castellan set the wrench down and looked at the schematic. "He will be now." Back on the Scout, Ashdown watched the Zafrani patrol drift into effective engagement range. Her sensors showed 3 cruisers, a supply tender, and a flagship with more point defense than a battle group. The flagship's shield array was active, its weapons cold but ready. She keyed the comm again. "Commodore, they're moving into weapons range." "They're not hailing." Farrow's voice came back, still unhurried. "That's expected. He wants to see if we'll run. We won't." Ashdown swallowed. "What are our orders?" Farrow paused. "Wait." She waited. The minutes stretched, each one thin as wire. Then the Zafrani flagship's forward batteries lit up. 4 inbound, Ashdown said, her voice flat. "Bearing 00. Point blank." She didn't flinch. She had been trained not to, but she watched the 4 streaks of light cross the gap and strike the hull of the Winter's Gate, and she counted the impacts like her grandmother had taught her to count rivets on a pressure seal. 1, 2, 3, 4. None of them left a mark. Ashdown stared at the display. The hull integrity reading hadn't so much as flickered. She checked the slide rule again. Not for a number this time, but for something else. Something her grandmother had once said about the difference between a wall and a door. The doctrine had been correct for 7,000 years, she said to herself. It had simply never been tested. She had not heard Farrow's voice on the channel, but she knew what he would say next, because she had heard him say it once before, in a briefing that felt like a lifetime ago. "We don't build to be believed," Farrow said, quiet and clear. "We build to be ready." The Winter's Gate fired once, and everything changed. 3 hours earlier, on the Zafrani flagship's bridge, before the first round was ever loaded, Fleet Marshal Threx Dovin reviewed the patrol's morning sweep logs with the same mechanical attention he gave to a pressure check. His fused left claw rested on the edge of his command station, the iron-gray ridges of his carapace catching the bridge's constant glow. He did not look at the sensor specialist who had flagged an anomalous reading. He looked at the summary line, saw the word null in the contact field, and moved on. "Routine," he said. "File it." The specialist hesitated. "Sir, the reading came from the same quadrant where our prospectors reported a mass shadow last cycle. It might be worth a closer sweep." Dovin's claw tightened on the edge. He had carved 43 tallies into his desk over the years, each one a verified doctrine call, each one a moment where he had been right and everyone else had been wrong. He did not need a 44th. "The Aldergate expanse is clear," he said. "We have shown the flag. We will continue the patrol as scheduled." He did not ask to see the raw data. He did not ask the specialist's name. He turned his attention to the tactical display, where 3 cruisers and a supply tender drifted in formation, and he began to plan the next system's flag-showing route. In the observation alcove behind the command station, Attaché Eilenson Brand watched the exchange with her inner membranes pale and still. She held a data slate against her chest, the same slate she had placed on the war chamber table hours earlier, the one Dovin had dismissed. She had been dismissed 3 times before in her career, each time for raising questions that the doctrine had already answered. She had learned to keep her voice quiet and her records precise. She looked at the slate. The reading from the current patrol sensors had matched her earlier log within 4%. That was not a coincidence. That was a pattern. She did not speak. She had learned that speaking too soon only earned her another mark in the personnel file. Instead, she stepped to the secondary comm station and transmitted a private message to the patrol's lead scout, a young Zephrani officer named Kelrith. She asked him to confirm the mass shadow's dimensions if he had a clear line. Kelrith replied within 90 seconds. His message was clipped, 4.65 kilometers. No drive signature, no thermal bloom. It's not a debris cluster. Brand's membranes went from pale to translucent. She looked at Dovin's back and knew, with the certainty of someone who had been right 3 times before, that she would be ignored again, but she also knew that she would file this one anyway. She set the slate down and began typing a report that no one would read until it was too late. 200 kilometers away, inside the hollow anchorage's main bay, Commodore Farrow stood beside Chief Engineer Castellan as the Wintersgate's reactor spin-up vibrated through the deck plates. The ship was not designed for speed, it was designed for stillness. Its hull plating, layered in a pattern that had never been tested against live fire, absorbed the ambient radiation of the gas giant's shadow and returned nothing. Castellan wiped weld flux from her hands and checked a coupling. "They're maneuvering into point-blank range," she said. "They'll be in firing position in 14 minutes. Farrow nodded. He did not look at the tactical display. He looked at a small holographic schematic of the Wintersgate's shield array, the same array that would absorb whatever the Zephrani threw at it, and then, if necessary, return a single precise strike. "We have one shot," Castellan said. "The capacitor's at 98%. We can deliver a message or a wound. Which is it?" Farrow considered. "A message," he said. "We don't need to destroy them. We need to make them remember," Castellan grunted. She had built the shield array herself, with a team of engineers who had worked in the anchorage for 13 years without a single line in any diplomatic filing. She had never needed to test it. She had trusted the numbers. She looked at Farrow, the ensign on scout, Ashdown. "She's been holding station alone for 2 hours. She's not trained for combat. She's not going to fight," Farrow said. "She's going to watch, and she's going to log what she sees." He paused. "She has her grandmother's slide rule. She'll check twice." Castellan didn't laugh. She turned back to the console and began to run a final diagnostic on the shield dispersion. Aboard the scout, Ensign Ashdown watched the Zephrani flagship drift into the center of her forward viewport. It was a heavy vessel, bristling with point defense and capital-grade battery mounts, its hull scarred with the marks of 4 conquered sectors. She had read the intelligence files. She knew that Fleet Marshal Dovin had never lost a fleet-scale engagement. She also knew that he had never faced a human ship built to these specifications. She checked the sensors again. The 4,650-meter hull of the Wintersgate hung in the void at her 2 o'clock, a dark wedge against the debris field. It did not transmit. It did not maneuver. It simply waited. She reached for her grandmother's slide rule and pulled it from the canvas pouch. The steel was cold against her thumb. She didn't need to calculate anything. The computer had already shown her the hull thickness, the shield density, the projected impact tolerance. But she checked anyway, sliding the cursor along the scale, her thumb tracing the same worn groove that her grandmother's thumb had traced for decades. She was checking twice. She was not yet believing once. The comm channel crackled. Farrow's voice came through, flat and calm. "Ashdown, they're coming into lock. You have 2 minutes to fall back to the anchorage if you want." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the slide rule, then at the dark hull of the Wintersgate, then at the Zephrani flagship that was already orienting its forward batteries. "No," she said, "I'm staying. Somebody needs to log this." Farrow didn't argue. "Cop that. Maintain passive sensors." And Ashdown, "Sir, check twice." She smiled, a small, dry motion that didn't reach her eyes. "Already done." On the Zephrani bridge, Dovan finally turned his attention to the patrol commander's latest report. The commander, a Zephrani named Veth, had just received Kelrith's confirmation of the mass shadow's dimensions. Veth stood at attention, his carapace ridges flat against his skull, his voice pitched low. Fleet Marshal, the contact is confirmed. 4.65 kilometers. It is not a natural formation. The hull signature is consistent with what? Dovan's claw tapped the armrest. With a minor power scout ship, with a derelict, with a bluff. Vith hesitated. With a Terran vessel, but the dimensions are. Dovan stood. His full height, augmented by the raised command platform, cast a shadow over the tactical display. The Terran yards do not build above 800 meters. That is a documented fact. It has been doctrine for 7 millennia. Are you telling me the doctrine is wrong? Vith did not answer. He looked at Bran, who was still standing in the alcove, her data slate pressed against her chest. She did not look back. Dovan's fused claw curled into a fist. He had spent 40 years rising through the ranks on the strength of his correct calls, his unshakable faith in the institutional record. He had carved every victory into the edge of his desk. He was not about to let a single anomalous reading, one that had been dismissed by 3 prior patrols, filed and forgotten, become the thing that broke him. He turned to the weapons officer. Prepare a live-fire identification pass. 4 rounds, standard capital grade. We will observe the impact and settle this. The weapons officer blinked. Sir, that's a point-blank range. If the target is, it is not a threat. Dovan's voice was flat. It is a mistake, and we will correct it. He gave the order. The flagship's forward batteries swiveled, their targeting systems locking onto the dark hull of the Winter's Gate. The 3 cruisers fell back to observation distance, their commanders waiting for the visual confirmation that would restore the doctrine's perfect record. On the patrol's secondary comm, Bran's data slate received a new message. It was from Kelrith, the lead scout. It contained 3 words. They're going to fire. Bran's inner membranes flushed so bright they were visible from across the bridge. She did not speak. She did not move. She watched the countdown timer on her slate, the seconds until impact. The second she had left to file her report, she filed it anyway. She attached Ashdown's reading, her own 3 previous logs, and the 4% match. She sent it to the Directorate's Central Archive, to the Oversight Committee that never reviewed anything, and to a quiet Osavane researcher she knew in the Records Division. She did not expect a reply. She expected only that, one day, someone would look at the date and the time and understand that she had been right. The countdown reached 0. 4 rounds streaked across the gap. Each one struck the Winter's Gate's bow shielding with a flat, dead impact that sent no shockwave through the debris field. The hull did not scorch. It did not flex. It did not answer. On the Zephrani bridge, no one spoke. The weapons officer checked his displays. The rounds had impacted at full yield. The hull's integrity readout had not registered a change. It was as if the fire had simply ceased to exist. Dovan's hand remained raised from the firing command. He looked at the display. He looked at his claw. He opened his mouth to speak, to order another volley, to demand a sensor recalibration, to blame the weapons officer, and found that he had nothing prepared. Then the Winter's Gate fired once. The Zephrani bridge held its breath. For a full 3 seconds after the Winter's Gate fired, no one moved. The single shot had not struck the hull, the command deck, or any occupied compartment. It had found the forward shield array, a precise surgical strike that left the rest of the flagship intact. The display showed a clean hit. No secondary explosions, no cascade failures. Just a dark spot where the array had been, and a faint thermal bloom that faded as quickly as it had appeared. Dovan's hand was still raised. His claw, fused from an old reactor burn, trembled once, a small involuntary motion that no one on the bridge would ever mention aloud. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue a counterorder, to blame the weapons officer for a misfire. No words came. The doctrine had been correct for 7,000 years. He had carved 43 tallies into his desk to prove it, and now, in the span of a single shot, the evidence had been reduced to a sensor ghost. He lowered his hand. "Report," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of its usual command resonance. Damage assessment. The weapons officer stared at his display. "Sir, the forward shield array is offline. No casualties. No hull breach. The shot was precise." Dovan finished for him. "I saw it." He looked at the tactical display. The Winter's Gate had not moved. It had not transmitted a demand, a warning, or a declaration. It had simply shown that it could, That was the entire message. Dovin's carapace ridges flattened against his skull. He had spent 40 years being right. He had 30 seconds or less to figure out how to be wrong without losing the command. "Hold fire," he said. "All units, hold position. We will observe." No one on the bridge looked at him. They looked at their displays, their instruments, their own reflections in the polished console surfaces. They were waiting for an order that made sense. Dovan turned to the comm station. "Contact the patrol commander. I want a full sensor sweep of that vessel. Every band. Every frequency. I want to know what we just fired at." The comm officer nodded and began transmitting, but his fingers moved slower than usual, as if the weight of what they had just witnessed had settled into the bones of the ship itself. In the observation alcove, Bran watched the data flood into her slate. The Winter's Gate's hull signature had not changed after the impact. It had not increased its emissions, activated its drive, or transmitted a single word. It was still there, dark and waiting, a question that the Doctrine had no answer for. She looked at her message queue. The quiet Osavane researcher in the records division had not yet replied. She had not expected one. But she had filed the report anyway, because that was what she did. She filed things, and one day, someone would read them. She keyed a new message to Kelrith, the lead scout, status. His reply came within seconds, unchanged. "The vessel has not responded. It has not moved. It is waiting for something." Bran's membranes went pale again. She knew what it was waiting for. It was waiting for the Directorate to admit that it had been wrong. Aboard the Scout, Ashdown watched the Zephrani flagship drift into a holding orbit. Its forward batteries still trained on the Winter's Gate, but no longer firing. She had logged the entire exchange, the 4 rounds, the lack of impact, the single precise reply. She had checked her instruments twice, then a third time, and each time the numbers held steady. She pulled out her grandmother's slide rule and held it in her palm. The steel was cold, but her fingers were warmer now, the tension of the last few minutes leaving a faint tremor in her grip. She ran her thumb along the worn edge and thought about what her grandmother had said, all those years ago, in the cramped kitchen of a house that no longer existed. "Check twice, believe once," that was what she had said. But Ashdown had always taken it as a lesson in caution, in not trusting the first read. She had never considered that it might also be a lesson in patience, in building something that only needed to work once. She looked at the slide rule's engraved scales. The numbers were still there, the same marks her grandmother had made with a fine-tipped scribe, corrections to the factory-printed lines. She had used this tool to calculate hull tolerances by hand, back when computers were too new to trust. She had taught herself to check twice, not because she was careful, but because she knew that the first answer was seldom the full answer. Ashdown closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she keyed the comm. "Commodore Farrow, the shot was observed. The Zephrani have ceased fire. They're holding position." Farrow's voice came back, still flat and unhurried. "Good. We've delivered the message. Now we wait for them to read it. What if they don't?" Farrow paused. "Then we will deliver it again." He did not say where the second shot would strike. He did not need to. Ashdown understood that the Winter's Gate had not been built to fight a war. It had been built to end one. On the Zephrani flagship, Dovan had retreated to his private quarters, a narrow compartment behind the bridge, lined with commemorative plaques and a single carved desk. He stood before the desk now, his fused claw resting on the edge where he had carved his victories. 43 tallies, each one a moment where the Doctrine had been proven correct, where his judgment had been vindicated, where the Directorate's 7,000-year record had held firm. He looked at the latest carving still fresh from the morning. He had marked it before the patrol, before the contact, before everything had changed. He had been so certain that the day would be routine that he had already counted it as a victory. Now he did not know what to count it as. He sat down heavily, the carapace ridges along his spine pressing against the chair's back. His left hand, the fused claw, rested on the desk's surface. He had carried that injury for more than a century, a mark of the reactor burn that had nearly killed him in his first command. He had worn it as a badge of survival. Now it felt like a reminder of everything he could not control. His comm chimed. Director Firon's voice came through, clipped and formal. "Fleet Marshal, I have reviewed the sensor data. The vessel's hull composition is consistent with Terran construction protocols, but the dimensions are impossible." Dovan finished. "I am aware." Firon paused. "Then what do you intend to do?" Dovin did not answer immediately. He looked at the carving on his desk, the 43rd tally, the one he had made before the patrol. He had been so certain. He had been certain for 40 years. And now, in the space of a single shot, the certainty had been replaced by something he had never felt before. He did not know what to call it. "Withdraw the patrol," he said. "Return to Directorate space. I will file a full report." Firon was silent for a long moment. "The Directorate will expect an explanation. They will receive one," Dovin said. "I will tell them what we observed, and I will tell them that the doctrine requires revision." He cut the channel before Firon could reply. Then he sat in the silence of his quarters and stared at the 43rd tally, and for the first time in 214 years, he had nothing prepared to say next. 3 hours later, the Zafrani patrol had withdrawn to the edge of the Aldergate expanse, its cruisers forming a loose escort around the flagship. The Wintersgate had not followed. It had remained in the shadow of the dead gas giant, silent and unmoving, a dark wedge against the debris field. Ashdown had returned to the hollow anchorage, her scout docked in the main bay. She stood beside the Wintersgate's engineering access panel, her grandmother's slide rule still in her hand. Castellan was running a diagnostic on the shield array, her weld flux-stained fingers tracing the display. "Zero damage," Castellan said. "The plating absorbed the entire volley, not a single microfracture." Ashdown nodded. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the feeling in her chest, not relief, not triumph, but something quieter, something that felt like gratitude. She looked at the slide rule. The steel was warm now, warmed by her palm. She ran her thumb along the worn edge and thought about what her grandmother had said. All those years ago, check twice, believe once. It was not a method, it was a philosophy. It was the belief that the first reading was never the full reading, that patience was not weakness, that being underestimated was only a weakness if you needed to be seen. She had been taught to check twice. She had finally learned what it meant. "Commodore," she said, keying the comm. "The patrol has withdrawn. No further contact." Pharaoh's voice came through, calm and steady. "Good. The message has been received. Now we wait for the Directorate's response. What do you expect?" Pharaoh paused. "I expect they will bury the report. I expect they will revise the doctrine in private, without public acknowledgement. I expect they will pretend this never happened. And if they don't," Pharaoh was silent for a long moment, "then we will deliver the message again. We don't build to be believed, Ensign. We build to be ready." Ashdown looked at the slide rule in her hand. She understood, for the first time, that it was never a saying. It was the whole design philosophy. She pocketed the slide rule and walked toward the bay exit. Behind her, the Wintersgate sat in its dock, dark and waiting, a question that the Directorate had 7,000 years to answer and only now had begun to consider. The Directorate's official response arrived 72 hours later, buried in a routine communiqué that contained no mention of the Wintersgate, no acknowledgement of the patrol, and no revision to the doctrine. It was a single line appended to the morning's fleet-wide bulletin. "All units are reminded to verify sensor calibration prior to reporting anomalous contacts." Dovin read the line 3 times. He was standing in his private quarters aboard the flagship, the carapace ridges along his spine pressed flat against his collar. The communique displayed on a slate he had not touched since the patrol withdrew. His fused claw rested on the edge of his desk, the 43rd tally still fresh beneath his thumb. He had expected this. He had spent 40 years in the Directorate's military bureaucracy. He knew that the institution did not admit error. It merely stopped speaking of the thing that had been wrong. The doctrine would not be revised aloud. It would simply be allowed to fade, replaced by a new unspoken assumption, that Terran capabilities were no longer certain. He looked at the communique again. Verify sensor calibration. It was a dismissal. It was also a confession, wrapped in the language of procedure. He set the slate down and did not reply. In the archive section of the Halvern Concourse, Attaché Ilsen Brand received a different message. It came from the quiet Ossivane researcher she had contacted 3 days earlier, a researcher named Teth, who worked in the records division and had never once been promoted. Teth's reply was brief, almost clinical. "Your reports have been cross-referenced with 3 prior patrol logs. The margin of error is within 4%. I have filed a supplemental note in the central registry. No action is expected." Brand's inner membranes flushed a pale green, not from stress, but from something close to satisfaction. She had filed the reports. She had been ignored. But the record was there now, stamped with her name and Teth's verification, buried in the institution's vast archive where no one would look until it was too late. She saved the message and closed the slate. She did not expect a promotion. She did not expect an apology. She expected only that, one day, someone would search the archive and find her name attached to the truth. That was enough. At the hollow anchorage, the Wintersgate's maintenance cycle had begun. Castellan stood in the main bay, her weld flux-stained hands folded across her chest, watching the automated repair drones trace the hull's surface. There was no damage to repair. The plating had absorbed the rounds without a single microfracture, but she had ordered a full diagnostic anyway. It was her habit. She checked twice. Pharaoh walked into the bay, his coffee cup still steaming. He had slept for the first time in 2 days, and the circles under his eyes had faded to a pale gray. "Any movement from Directorate Space?" he asked. "None," Castellan said. "They've buried it. No public revision, no reprimand, no statement." Pharaoh nodded. He had expected that too. And Ensign Ashdown, Castellan gestured toward the bay's secondary docking port. "She's in her quarters. She hasn't said much since the patrol." "She's processing," Pharaoh said. "She's been taught to check twice her whole life." "She just learned what it means to believe once," Castellan grunted. "She didn't understand philosophy. She understood load-bearing structures and shield dispersion patterns. But she had seen the slide rule in Ashdown's hand, and she had seen the look on the young ensign's face when she realized that her grandmother's tool was not a lucky charm. It was a design philosophy. In her quarters, Ashdown sat on the edge of her bunk, the slide rule cradled in both hands. The steel was warm from her grip, the engraved scales catching the compartment's dim light. She had been sitting like this for an hour, her thumb tracing the worn edge that her grandmother's thumb had traced for decades. She had thought about the slide rule as a habit, a superstition, a link to a woman she had barely known. She had checked her readings twice, 3 times, 4 times, because that was what her grandmother had taught her. But she had never understood why. Now she understood. The slide rule was not a tool for measurement, it was a tool for patience. It was a reminder that the first answer was never the full answer, that certainty was not observation, that being underestimated was only a weakness if you needed to be seen. Her grandmother had known that. She had built hulls by hand, calculated tolerances with a slide rule and a pencil, and trusted the numbers only after she had checked them twice. Ashdown looked at the engraved lines on the steel. They were not corrections, they were second thoughts. They were the marks of someone who had learned that the first reading was always partial, and that the full truth only emerged when you were willing to wait for it. She tucked the slide rule back into her canvas pouch. She had checked twice. Now she believed once. 3 weeks later, the Directorate quietly revised its classification of human shipbuilding capabilities. The revision was not announced. It appeared as a single line in an internal database update, accessible only to senior command officers.
It read, Terran Vessel Construction, Upper Bound Revised. See Addendum 47C. Dovin did not see the addendum. He had been reassigned to a desk position in the Halvern Concourse, his operational command transferred to a younger officer who had not yet been tested.
He sat in a small office, far from the war chamber, and he did not carve tallies into his desk. He had stopped carving them the day after the patrol. He had not spoken of the Wintersgate to anyone. He had filed his report, the one he had promised Fyron, and it had been summarily archived. He knew that the doctrine was now a lie, maintained only by the institution's refusal to update its records. He knew that the Directorate would never admit what it had seen. And he knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with doctrine, that he would never command a fleet again. In the archive section, Bran received a notification that her supplemental note had been reviewed by a senior records auditor. The auditor's comment was brief. Noted. No further action required. Bran read the comment and did not smile. She had not filed her reports for the recognition. She had filed them because she had seen the pattern 3 times, and she had learned that silence was not the same as acceptance. She saved the notification and closed her slate. Then she returned to her work, the quiet Osavane researcher in the corner, filing the truth where no one would look until it was too late. Ashdown had not left the hollow anchorage since the patrol. She had logged the readings, watched the impact, and filed her report. She had seen the Wintersgate's response and understood that it was not a weapon, it was a statement. A quiet, patient statement, built over 13 years, designed to work only once. She stood in the bay now, the slide rule in her hand, looking up at the dark hull of the Winter's Gate. The ship had not moved since the patrol. It hung in the anchorage's dock, silent and waiting, a question that the Directorate had refused to answer. She ran her thumb along the worn steel edge of the slide rule and understood, for the first time, that it was never a saying. It was the whole design philosophy. She did not speak. She did not smile. She simply held the tool that had been passed down to her, and she believed. The doctrine had been correct for 7,000 years. It had simply never been tested.